Friends and family, for a few moments, I want to talk from the subject, what should the church be doing when the people cannot breathe? What should the church be doing when the people cannot breathe? Friends and family, it has been 13 days since the murder of George Floyd by the knee of Derek Chauvin. And that brother Floyd's murderer has been charged, and the officers who facilitated this murder have also been charged, is due to the great work of people who lifted up their voices and used their bodies to go protest in the streets. But friends and family, the cry from George Floyd, "I can't breathe," has again struck a nerve in our hearts and in our minds, in our communities. It has struck a nerve in a similar way that it did in 2010 when we heard the cry coming from the voice of Eric Garner. But over the last 6 years, friends and family, this phrase, "I can't breathe," has taken on metaphorical meanings as well. People have used "I can't breathe" to talk about the way that policing policies have continued to strangle the life out of so many communities, especially Black communities. People have used "I can't breathe" to talk about the economic stranglehold that has had such a tight grip on the economy of Black communities. That even in a month when the president of these yet to be United States celebrates the nation's employment rate rising, the unemployment rate for African Americans has still dropped. "I can't breathe," friends and family, could be used to talk about the experience of people in Flint, Michigan, who are still struggling without any water. "I can't breathe" could be used to talk about the experience of people here in Cincinnati, in the neighborhood that we know as Winton Terrace, where the quality of air is so polluted because of the factories. "I can't breathe" could be used to talk about the experience of people in Lincoln Heights who are forced to live near an outdoor gun range that's used by police units and sheriff's offices from around the county, where they are forced to listen to the fire of gun bullets on a daily basis. "I can't breathe." I can't breathe. This phrase, friends and family, has been used to talk about the many ways in which the life of people in America, particularly Black people, is forced to disproportionate suffering. "I can't breathe." And over the last 6 years, the question has been raised time and time again, where is the church? What is the role of the church? How is the church showing up? And what should the church be doing? But friends and family, this is not a question that's just been confined to this era. The role of the church has been in question throughout the history of the Christian church in Europe and in this country. In fact, friends and family, the challenge is that as much as the history of the church has had voices that have been prophetic, voices who have tried to speak truth to power, voices who have tried to call the nation to its best selves, that the history of the church has also been wrapped up, tied up, tangled up, not just in Jesus, but also in racism. The church has been wrapped up, tied up, and tangled up, not just in Jesus, but also in capitalism. There is no other way to describe the history, friends and family, when we look at the fact that leaders of the church across multiple denominations were active participants in a slave trade that kidnapped people and forced them into a life of unspeakable brutality and horror, and still had the audacity to pray that God would hear their prayers. There's no other way to describe the history, friends and family, that songs like Amazing Grace were written by a slave trader who traded slaves. And the song was actually written when he was on a slave ship, worried about his own life as a storm raged, but yet not concerned about the lives of people that he was trading away for profit. That song has made its way squarely into the Christian canon with little historical note or accountability of the circumstances that created it. There's no other way to describe the history, friends and family, that the Ku Klux Klan was not formed in the shadows of the Christian community, that the Ku Klux Klan was not formed even on the front steps of the church community, friends and family, but the Ku Klux Klan was formed in church houses, that they would meet in church basements, that people would come and interrupt worship to tell people that they needed to go lynch somebody, and that white men would get up out of worship and run out and perform a lynching and then come back to worship as if nothing ever happened. There's no other way to describe, friends and family, that people like Billy Graham, who was considered America's preacher, used his influence to perpetuate war in other parts of the world. That as the nation came to grips with the fact that it had to pull out of the Vietnam War, that the war was unjust and immoral from the beginning, and that America was not only losing resources, but was losing its moral voice among other nations because of its continued presence in Vietnam, that Billy Graham went to the president and urged the president not to pull out of Vietnam, but to empty out our weapons, our arsenal, to empty out our missiles and bombs, to flatten Vietnam. That leaders of the Christian church could hold such a position talks about how the church has been tied up in the violence, has been tied up in the white supremacy, has been tied up in the racism and capitalism that has been the lifeblood of America. And then, friends and family, in recent history, we have seen that as the mood of people, as the middle of the nation has moved ever so slightly towards justice, that churches have seen that it is unseemly to be such vocal proponents of racist policies. And so they settled to be quiet bystanders. They settled for mere words and platitudes, friends and family, while not speaking about the injustices that happened. There are far too many churches that continue to profit while people were suffering and did not say a word for fear that it would influence and that it would harm their bottom line. And now that social justice has become a trending topic on social media. Now, friends and family, that it seems that more people are sympathetic to the plight of Black people. Now that the video of George Floyd's murder at the knee of Derek Chauvin is causing people to question where they have allied themselves over the course of history. Now that Chick-fil-A and Coca-Cola are trying to create a little space for themselves by attaching their name to Black Lives Matter movements. Now that corporations are seeing that it is more profitable for them to stand with people than it is for them to be silent. Now that it is seen as politically acceptable to say so. Now many churches are running to the fray. Now, many church leaders are trying to run to the front of the line. Now, many people who have so long lost or forgotten their voice have seemed to found it. And friends and family, I'm not going to even take this moment to ask them where they've been this entire time. But I'm just going to say, I'm glad you finally showed up. But now that you've shown up to the party, now that you've found a moral voice, now that the church is trying to speak out on issues of racial justice, now you might want to stop for a minute. You might want to slow down just a little bit. And you might want to learn from people who have been in this space. And so for those who are new to the space, those who are new in the church world to speaking out for social justice, I want to give a little instruction on how the church might show up in this moment. What the church might do for those who can't breathe. Friends and family, in this text, we see a situation that can speak metaphorically to our situation right now emerging in this text. The history of this particular passage, friends and family, for those of you who do not remember, is that the prophet Elijah, in the middle of announcing a drought that would impact the nation because of the injustice of King Ahab. Elijah had been hiding. He had been secluded. He had socially distanced himself down by the Wadi Cherubith, the river of separation. And there at the river, he had been hiding out while the ravens brought him food. But God let Elijah know that even he was not exempt from what was happening to the nation. And so that river that seemed to be stocked just for Elijah eventually dried up. And Elijah had to leave his place of separation and go find community. He had to leave his place of isolation and go into the community. And God sent him to a widow's house. A widow in the land of Zarephath, a widow in the land of the people who did not believe in Yahweh, a widow in the land of the people who were not his own. God sent him to a stranger's house, a stranger who was considered to be the lowest of the low on the economic ladder, somebody who could not even conduct business for herself without the risk of being cheated, somebody who could not even represent herself in the legal system of the time, somebody who had no status, who had no class, somebody who was considered to be the lowest of the low. God sent Elijah to her house. And there in that house, God blessed so that food never ran out. God blessed so that they were always able to eat day after day. When it looked like they were down to their last, God made a way for them to survive. And it looked like things were going to be okay. If you get to verse 16 and you stopped reading there, it looks like the story is going to be a story of great triumph. It looked like the story was going to be a heavily ever after story. But then verse 17 happens. There in the midst of a nationwide drought, there in the midst of a natural disaster that was taking the lives of people, there in the midst of this catastrophe that was brought on and accelerated by wicked policies, there in the midst of the tragedy, another tragedy occurs. There in the midst of this trying time, now the widow's son loses his life. This widow's son, this unnamed boy in the text, unnamed son of an unnamed mother, this boy who would have been considered to be unimportant even in his country for the fact that children were considered to be expendable to the whims of a capricious God who demanded a child sacrifice for worship. This child who would have been considered to be expendable has lost his life, and nobody is there to mourn the child except for the mother and Elijah. Nobody comes to bring gifts of food. Nobody comes to console the mother. Nobody comes to care about this child. Nobody comes. And there's only the mother's tears that announce the death of the child. And there in this moment, as she is holding her dead son, a son that no one else cares about, she asks this question of Elijah: why did you come here in the first place? You were supposed to come for help, but instead you have brought death. Why have you come here? I can only imagine, friends and family, that it's the same question that the people who videotaped George Floyd's murder asked about the police. Why did you show up here in the first place? You're supposed to be here to protect and serve, but instead you are taking this man's life in front of us. Why have you shown up here in the first place? It's the question, I believe, that the boyfriend of Breonna Taylor is asking right now. Why did you show up here in the first place? Why did you have a no-knock warrant to come into my house when I've done nothing wrong and you've taken the life of the woman that I love? Why did you show up here in the first place? It's the question that Ahmaud Arbery's family is asking of the two men that got in a truck and chased him down, hit him with his car, and then shot him until he died. Why did you come here in the first place? Our son, our brother, our family member was just running down the road, was just jogging, minding his own business, and you chased him down and took his life. Why did you show up in the first place? This question, friends and family, this question, as searing as it is a question spoken by so many Black people. Why are you here in the first place? Well, the first thing, friends and family, that the church can or should be doing in a time when people can't breathe is we ought to help people find language for their grief and anger. Friends and family, I want to let you know that capitalistic Christianity is built on the lack of language for grief and anger. Capitalistic Christianity is filled with language for shame and remorse. It's filled with language that judges us for the things that happen to us. That capitalistic Christianity is an expert on making us feel that whatever has happened in our life, it is because we have done something wrong, or at the very least, we did not have enough faith to stop it in the first place. There is a lot of language that judges and shames, but there is not language for grief and anger. Capitalistic Christianity even has language for joy. It has language for praise. It has language to lift up God, but it lacks language of grief and anger. Because grief and anger don't sell well. Because it's hard to raise an offering off of grief and anger. Grief and anger don't bring people, don't pack people by the thousands into auditoriums. Grief and anger don't stir people's devotion to come back day in and day out. It is much easier for us to ignore the hard emotions. It's much easier for us to bypass the difficult emotions. It's much easier for us to act as if those emotions aren't real, or as if they don't impact us, or they don't apply to us. But Christianity, friends and family, has to throw off the shackles of capitalism and give people language for grief and anger. We don't have to go far, friends and family. We don't have to go far to find it. It is throughout the biblical text. If we read just a little bit further, if we read more than just the 23rd Psalm, which says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." If we read just a little more in the Psalms, then we will find Psalms like we read this morning, Psalms like Psalm 120 that ask God, "Where are you? Where are you when people are against me? God, I speak peace, but my enemies speak war. Where are you, God?" That the cry that Jesus gave on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" was not an original message from the heart of Jesus, but he is quoting scripture. The psalmist asked the same question, my God, why have you forsaken me? God, where are you when trouble is breaking? God, where are you when my heart is breaking? God, where are you when there's trouble all around? God, where are you? Friends and family, I believe that one of the reasons that we continue to see so much hate and vitriol from a segment of white America directed towards Black people, towards Mexicans, towards Asians, towards whatever people of color are designated as the villain of the month. The reason we see so much hate and vitriol is that so many of these people are in churches that are not helping them to wrestle with the pain they are experiencing in their own life. And so they are there wrestling with their own economic pain, wrestling with their own broken dreams, wrestling in a world that says that they should have everything that they ever wanted, and looking around and seeing that they don't have what they need, and they are trying to figure out what is wrong, and the church is not giving them any language to process what is happening to them, and so they fall sway to a false prophet. They fall sway to erroneous leadership. They fall sway to whatever trickster mounts up with in the clothes of leadership and tries to tell them who to blame. And because the church has been silent and has not given language for them to process their grief and their anger, they listen to whoever is scratching their itching ears. Church, friends, and family, we have to give people language of grief and anger. We have to allow people to question even God. I want you to know, friends and family, that it is not our duty as the church, it is not our duty as Christians to defend God's honor. Don't you know that God doesn't need you to defend God's honor? God does not need you to defend God's righteousness. God does not need you to defend God's holiness. Friends and family, I want you to know that God was God before you got here, and that God will be God once you are dead and sleeping in your grave. That God does not need you to try to defend God to other people, friends and family. Let people ask the questions. In fact, if you just pause long enough, you might see that the questions they are asking might be questions that you have in your own stomach, but that you've been taught that you can't ask. And so you're trying to silence someone else's questions because you've been taught that you can't ask those questions of God. But friends and family, I want you to know that God can handle all of your questions. God can handle all of your grief. God can handle all of your anger. You can bring it all to God. And God's love is big enough to embrace you and your anger. God's love is big enough to embrace you and your grief. God's love is big enough. We need to give people language for their grief and anger. The second thing I would lift up, friends and family, is that we should join people in their grief. There were historic moments, friends and family, where the church believed that it was its most important mission to save the lives of people. And in doing so, one of the things that the church taught people to do was to bite their tongues, was to not speak against the white establishment that would snatch life from people with no regard, to not speak a word that would cause a church to be bombed, as we saw in the civil rights movement, not to speak a word that would cause people to be snatched out of churches and lynched, not speak a word that would threaten not only the life of the individual, but the life of community. And so Black churches for so many years taught people to be quiet for fear that it would, that people would lose their lives. But friends and family, I want you to know that there is no appropriate way to express your grief to people who don't want to hear it. There is no appropriate way to express your anger to those who are disinclined to listen to it. Friends and family, we are seeing now the contradiction of people who are asking people to peacefully protest when they challenged Colin Kaepernick when he was doing just that. But not only that, friends and family, but the greatest peaceful protester in the history of the United States on that very short list must be Martin Luther King Jr. Somebody who was an advocate for social justice, but did so peacefully, who marched into places where he knew he was going to get beat and did so without striking back, who stood by people as they sat at lunch counters and encouraged them to do so with dignity without lashing back, who encouraged people to turn the other cheek for justice. That great drum major of justice, Martin Luther King Jr., was the paragon of peaceful protest, and they killed him. Friends and family, there is no way to be respectable enough so that people who do not want to hear your protest, so that people who are profiting from the pain that is being afflicted will listen to it. And so as the church, we've got to stop trying to get in, trying to tell people that they have to use their words in this manner or that manner. We've got to stop trying to police people's language because it seems to offend Christian sensibilities. We've got to try to stop distancing ourselves just because the people who use the language they're using would not be appropriate for the church house, friends and family. It is all right for people to use language that expresses the heart of their anger. When people are dying in the streets, it's not the time to talk about language. We've got to stop trying to police people's grief and rather join them in their grief. Can't you see the prophet Elijah? As the woman is there holding her dead son, blaming Elijah for what is happening. And Elijah doesn't scold the woman for her condemnation. Elijah doesn't blame the woman for her lack of faith. Elijah doesn't say that it must be the woman's fault for being a single mother in the first place. Elijah doesn't condemn the life of the woman for the death of her child. Elijah instead takes the boy, brings the boy to his room, and then cries out to God, and using the same words that the woman used to express her grief, Elijah expresses his grief to God, saying, God, what have you done? Why have you caused this widow to lose her son? Friends and family, Elijah adds his voice of lament, his voice of grief to the voice of the widow. And he cries with her. He cries alongside of her and lifts up her cries to the voice of God. And friends and family, if the church can be doing anything in this moment, it is that we should be crying with the Floyd family. We should be crying with the Taylor family. We should be crying with the Arbery family, and not just crying out of sadness, but we should also be crying for justice. We should also be crying for accountability. We should also be crying for an end of the murder of Black lives. We ought to raise our voices with the people who are crying. The last thing, friends and family, that the church ought to be doing in this moment is the church ought to help to bring breath back into the community. Elijah did not just cry out to God and walk away from the situation. But the Bible says that Elijah remained there in his room with the boy until breath came back into the boy. And while breath may never again enter the body of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery or any of the people needlessly and recklessly killed in the name of law and order, breath can re-enter our communities. Friends and family, I just believe that the same God who caused a valley of dry bones to rise up can breathe new life into dry churches, can breathe new life into dry schools, can breathe new life into dry institutions, can breathe new life into dry communities. The same God who caused the valley of dry bones to rise up, can breathe new life into dry families, can breathe new life into dry lives. The same God can breathe new life. And we've done it before, friends and family. We've done this before. Just one generation after slavery, that Black people were able to come together and organize and pull the pennies they had to create institutions of higher learning. They were able to pool their resources together to get people elected into Congress, that they were able to pool their resources together to establish leadership to help transition them into the next phase of their history. We've done it before. We've built Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, friends and family. We've done it before. We've built sustainable communities in Rosewood, Florida. We've done it before. And if we've done it before with the help of God, I want you to know, friends and family, that we can do it again. We can breathe new life into the ravaged communities in Cincinnati and in Detroit, in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, in Charlotte, North Carolina, and in Los Angeles, in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Oakland. We can breathe new life. If the church, friends and family, if we will commit not to run when things get difficult, not to leave when things get hard, but if we will commit to stay and to pray, if we will commit to stay and to work, if we will commit to join our hands in the movement of God, we can breathe new life. What should the church be doing when the communities cannot breathe? We ought to give people language for their grief and anger. We ought to join people in their grief rather than trying to police or curtail their grief. And we ought to stay there in the painful moments, stay and pray and work until we bring breath and life back to the community.